And now I'm going to say all that stuff again. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sustain Academic Open Source Working Group. This is a once a month working group where we talk about things going on in the world of sustainability for open source and academia. Normally, it doesn't mean sustainability in terms of environmental sustainability, but more about how do we keep the ecosystem going? What can we do to support each other? How can we build better networks to deal with systemic risks, which there are many. Normally, for these calls, we have one speaker and then some questions. For this call, we're actually going to divide it up a bit, and we're going to have our speaker come on around halfway through. They're a very busy person. Maybe they just had something else going on. Maybe they're eating lunch. I don't know. But they're going to join us at the bottom of the hour. And so before that, we have an opportunity to actually talk to each other about what we're doing. And if we have any questions about sustainability, this is excellent for a couple of reasons. One of them is that the theme doesn't have to come from me. It can come from any of you if you have any questions. The other one is that it's just time that doesn't come out of, it doesn't have to be a complete thought. If you just have questions that you want to ask about stuff, we can still talk about that, right? So it doesn't have to be, it can be a priori. So we're going to do that for the next 30 minutes. And then at 12:30, we're going to have Eva or Aeva. I'm sorry, I've forgotten how to pronounce their name correctly. If I ever knew, and I'm looking forward to asking them. Aeva, come on. Aeva Black, I assume I'm pronouncing Black correctly, from CISA will be joining to talk about open source security, and that'll be a cool conversation. I'm not going to repeat it all here because I don't know, and that's going to happen anyway, and you're all here for that. A couple things to note, housekeeping before we begin. One, there's too many of us to do introductions, so we're not going to bother. But if you want to drop your name into the chat in the institution or company or just your favorite website that you have, you can do that in the chat. And that's a good way to see who else is here, so you have an idea who the audience is. And the other thing is that the chat is not under Chatham House rule, and neither is this meeting. Everything you say here can and will be used against you in the court of Mastodon. So feel free to just know that. If you don't want people to cite something, just say, hey, can no one quote me on this, please? And just go off the record there, but it will be recorded. We do have a code of conduct, which means be nice to each other. The code of conduct is actually significantly more built out than just be nice to each other with examples and governance structures. And you can go to SustainOSS.org and find the code of conduct there in the footer. If you have any issues during this call, feel free to message me. You can do that privately. You can email me at, there's an email for you, or you can email Claire Dillon, who will drop one of her emails in the chat. Especially if you have an issue with me, please let me know. This doesn't have to be an issue. You don't have to wait until it's a big enough thing. If you just feel uncomfortable at any point, please let us know. We're trying to make this a safe and awesome space. Thank you all for dropping names in the chat, and it's good to see all these awesome names and people. Because I am forgetful and a human, I'm going to ask any of the other co-organizers or any of you people, is there anything I missed? Sometimes I miss things in the introduction. No. Okay. In that case, we have 24 minutes to talk about open source in academia and sustainability. Is there any news that you want to bring up? Are there any events that are coming up that you want to talk about? And are there any questions or initiatives that you're working on that you want to share? Ideally, if it leads to an open conversation, but literally anything would be good. Kira just pointed out to me that they have a notes doc. Yes, you can just share with me to the doc, and then they can take notes themselves. You don't have to take notes if you don't want, Kira. If you could put that in the chat, that would be excellent. As a refresher, if anyone could use the raise hand function to indicate that they would like to talk. We had this document, which we made back in September or October. We're going to turn into a grant proposal, but then timing was really awful. About what we talk about when we talk about open source software in academia and what it means to be sustainable. And this is a document with a ton of separate examples about what sustainability could mean at the academic level. So feel free to read this if you have anything. I'm actually going to call on someone because no one's raised their hand yet. And I do apologize for maybe being a bit awkward as a moderator. This is a new format. We normally don't have 30 minutes free. So I am asking you to help me out. I want to call on Andrew real quick. and then Scott, and then Saeed. Andrew, can you talk about the preprint of the paper you have coming out?
Yes. So I went to a hackathon back in November at the CZI Institute. They provided a data set of software mentions. I got the link. I'll put the link in the chat here for that as well. And that basically was, they mined quite a few, was it 2.4 million biomedical papers for mentions of software, which could be proprietary or open source, where they basically took the names of packages published on package managers and then tried to match them with names that were referenced in papers. The hackathon then was like, okay, well, we got all this data, go do something with it. And the area that I worked on was to try and then work out what the kind of the dependencies beneath those mentions were. So going all the way down, resolving a dependency tree for each mention, and then trying to connect the dots so that you can kind of see the hidden kind of more infrastructural libraries that would be used in a lot of the kind of low-level code that wouldn't necessarily get mentioned directly while still being able to receive credit was the idea. There's some really cool visualizations in that paper of the graphs that we had come out, as well as the caveats and kind of hacks that we did to be able to do this successfully in 2 days, because there's lots of edge cases that we ignored very conveniently. But I think it's got some interesting promise in trying to highlight the kind of the unsung heroes of people who are maintaining software that aren't necessarily, publishing papers, or even necessarily realizing that their software is used in science. Like for some very low level Python libraries, you may not even realize. So being able to highlight those people would be really valuable.
That's really awesome. Two of your co-authors have agreed to come on the Sustain podcast.
Excellent.
I think we'll be doing that next month. So that'll be Boris and I think Eva.
Excellent. That'll be great.
So I'm very, very excited to talk to Boris and Eva about that. And that'll be coming out probably in actually a couple of months for you to listen to, maybe a bit sooner, in mid-May. But that's really cool. Thank you for that work, Andrew. Did you have anything that you wanted to ask people about besides just check this out and read it?
No, I mean, the
Cool.
part of the problem that makes it difficult to replicate in other places is you need the contents of the paper to mine those software mentions. So it only really can be replicated for open access papers right now, whereas CZI had access to lots of papers, like lots more than you normally would have to be able to generate that data. So it's not necessarily kind of something that can easily just be everyone run this same code and get see what they get for their particular area.
Yeah.
So but it's my first ever paper that I've been kind of co-authored, which was kind of cool.
Amazing. Congrats.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Scott, did you have something you wanted to say? Your hand went down.
Yeah, I did. I'll keep it brief. I'm currently almost nearly fully engaged in focusing on the consumer side of risk management. Think software assurance and supply chain risk management in the use of open source software. We're not talking about open source software that necessarily is supported through contracts through AWS or Red Hat, but I'm talking about actually, pulling from the sources, in the wild, right? And I guess the thing I want to leave with the group is I'm trying to move away from the idea of caveat emptor or buyer beware, more to buyer aware. I want that to catch on. So if you can help me get that to catch on, I'd appreciate it. But myself, another member of the Software Engineering Institute, her name's Carol Woody, and another former SEI actually a distinguished member of the SEI community. Her name is Nancy Mead. She was supported by Saeed's open source program office. We have our a paper which is underlying some of this work with the Naval Postgraduate School, which is in pre-publication now, which should come out within weeks now, once that symposium starts. But I'm here because I do want to hear what Aeva Black has to say, but also it's a big interest to me that having a healthy environment to allow open source software systems, ecosystems flourish and be sustained, right, as a supply source on that supply chain side is of great interest to me. Over.
I love that. Thank you. That sounds great. If you have your stuff in preprint, did you put it up on archive? Is that available yet? Or in review?
I don't know. I mean, what I have is the PDF that actually goes to the symposium. They'll put their stuff around it, and then that's what gets published. So I don't know what's it's all marked correctly, but I don't know what the proper way to do that is. I'll take hints. But
so that sounds to me like if you have the PDF that you've submitted, but it hasn't yet been totally formatted for them, but it's in review at the moment, you can put that on, I think BioArchive would be the best one. Andrew might actually know, or Saeed might know, which one of the archive sites that takes preprints for computer science.
Yeah, yeah, so it's not in review, it's past review. It's just waiting to be put into the final proceedings. That's all. So yeah, throw a link down in the linky and I'll do it. What the heck? They can only yell at me. So
yeah, I think just a regular archive, I don't know what to call it, original archive, regular archive is probably yes, what Richard just linked to.
all right, yeah, I will throw it there within the next hour. Unless it gets hard.
No, that sounds great. Archive is really useful, not just for preprints. Partially, it's more useful as well because it can also be a data source. So Andrew was talking about CZI making a biomedical database. I've seen a couple papers that look at all of the astronomy papers that are on archive and doing similar interesting biometrics or metrics of them. This is also used to train LLMs, which has been really interesting. I saw a cool talk by HPC Asia about this. I'll see if I can find it. Saeed, you had something.
Yeah, a question, I guess, with this group. Wonder how much you are tracking with the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU, and more specifically, how much you're tracking what implications it has on universities in terms of our researchers, our students, and so on producing open source that may get used in Europe. And I am not an expert on the CRA. I am not a lawyer. I can go on, but just the main point being, I could be getting this wrong. But from what I've read and what I've seen in various video presentations and so on, it's converging around these two concepts of a supplier and a steward. And the supplier, as you might imagine, is someone who produces, to Scott's point, produces open source that becomes part of the supply chain and people use it further downstream. And then the steward, again, my sense is interpretation came about because the large open source software foundations like the Linux Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, and so on, and the various repos that provide access to open source were very concerned that if they got labeled as a supplier, there would be liability issues and so on. So the steward concept reflects that perspective. I don't know that university roles map to either of those particularly well. And I could just not be understanding it, or it may not be accounted for, which would be a much bigger concern, of course. And I have not seen university people in Europe at these sessions talking about this issue. So I'm not sure that the universities in Europe accounted for it either. This is something I brought up in the context of a role I have with the Research Data Alliance US, and that there's a real interest in putting forward some kind of statement on behalf of US universities to say, this is our response to the CRA, or these are the concerns we have, because the stages that we're moving into now are coming up with standards and coming up with regulations about how all of these things will be, managed. And if it reaches a point where a university researcher produces something and they get classified as a supplier, that has very serious consequences. So again, I could be completely wrong. And if I am, somebody please tell me so that I don't spend more time on that. But I've been spending a lot of time on it, and I'm still very concerned about it.
Stephanie, then me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's right to remain vigilant, let's put it that way, on what's going on with that. I thought that the changes that were made post, like, everybody started, like Linux Foundation, Eclipse, getting kind of writing about it and pushing it, allowed for, and then basically, like, it wouldn't completely exempt people who were maybe doing this within a university setting, but the fact that there was kind of an idea of, like, whether or not you're making a kind of commercial that there's a commercial side, or that the kind of the money making aspect. So if you're doing this as a volunteer or something like that, that there was a certain level of you weren't necessarily held responsible. That's how I was reading the kind of the updated version of it. But I do think I mean I agree that I don't think I've seen enough universities looking into it to make sure that it's not negatively impacting their folks. So I think it's definitely something to keep in mind still. I mean, others may read that differently, but that's how I've been seeing it.
Me, then Shane. Thank you, Stephanie. Said, the people I know who are most on top of the CRA are OFE, who you probably know. You know that. I don't know if you've talked to Aster about this, who runs OFE.
I have, and he seemed to agree that universities were missing from the conversation.
I would argue that it's not just universities, it's also research institutions and like para-university things such as, say, NumFocus are also have a really important place to play here. And I'd be really curious to know if it might be beneficial for us to reach out to OFE about co-hosting a meeting about academic CRA stuff, because I'm not a legal expert in Europe. I mean, you can tell that by the way I talk, but maybe we should try to get someone who is and see if we can figure out.
I mean, I'm not a legal expert anywhere, and universities have researchers who produce software for which we charge. So it's not as if we can just say it doesn't affect any university. That's not true. I mean, there are some universities that produce open source software for which you have to charge. So I think in those cases we'd be considered a supplier or so on. But anyway, it is something to dive in more deeply.
Shane.
Yeah, the ASF has been thinking about this, and all the foundations have been thinking about this. One perspective from the software foundation perspective, which is a little bit different than academic, but nonetheless we have some of the same concerns in that we're not really commercial, but a lot of the CRA is making it look that way. Even with the changes recently to have open source stewards, which aren't necessarily held to the same standards as commercial companies, we're still very concerned about how much that will change in terms of expecting certain security stances and expecting certain policies of how you develop software, right? So can you show that you are following the best practices for security and for making releases and all those kind of things? So just for perspective, in the early days, our sort of default emergency backup plan was to simply ring fence Europe and not service them anymore, because all the 501c3s, right? The C6s can speak for themselves, but the C3s, we will not accept liability, right? There's no way that would work for a nonprofit. That's not a realistic concern, so we're trying to work forward. So that's what one of the links I put in there was the ASF, Eclipse, Python, half a dozen other 501c3s have gotten together to provide our perspective on, for example, best security practices for software development. So we'd like to take the things that we already do in more organized foundations, make those a codified set of standards, perhaps, for how you do secure software, and then say to the CRA people, hey, here's our great standard. So rather than having some standards body come up with it, or rather than having some commercial company come up with it, which would be hard for us as open source, right, to deal with, we're trying to come up with some of the standards ourselves based on what we already do. Those are things that universities could copy, because I think a lot of your workflows are much more like open source groups than commercial companies who have longer timeframes and have a lot more in terms of marketing and how they do that kind of side. So this is still a big deal. I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. But if people aren't thinking about it, then you're going to get caught later on. So it's definitely something to be very aware of as things go along.
Shane, the organizations that you're mentioning there, they have a consortium or something, a group that they're all working on these standards together, right? Are those open meetings?
Correct. I don't know. We'll all be run through Eclipse, since Eclipse does more standards-based stuff. That's the Eclipse in Belgium is the home, and our foundations have all agreed to work together openly, which is something that's actually kind of unusual to start with. And Eclipse will be working on a semi-standards kind of format. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm sure it will be to some degree open. It's just started, so.
Okay.
So so that's great to hear, and you're right that it's somewhat unusual. So that's even better to hear. I guess what I'd say is, I had a brief chat with Mike Milinkovich, the head of the Eclipse Foundation, at a CISA workshop not long ago about this. And what wouldn't be helpful is for 20 people to start contributing to that process directly. But we largely on this call represent a network that could say, here's a combined kind of consensus voice that we want to have represented in those conversations. And like I said, I just don't think universities are even, in most cases, thinking about it. So if your universities like mine, we indemnify faculty, right? But I don't know that anyone's thought through indemnification in the context of CRA. So that's the kind of thing I think we need to talk about more intentionally and cohesively, and then get it into these conversations, because universities aren't going to show up at the EU suddenly and say, US universities in particular, and say, you need to think about this. But if we can work through the forum that Shane just described, that might be the way to do it.
Yeah, I think that brings up another good point, is because each of the major software foundations, a lot of us have a large presence in the US. We sort of start most of our thought there. But when somebody said, oh, we could ring fence downloads in the EU and that would protect us from being liable. And he said, great, that means you're going to lose 3 of your directors and 30% of all of your friends and contributors to all your projects. I'm like, oh, no, we have to, each of the foundations there has to think globally at this point. And we're not as necessarily organized as each university is internally, but we are thinking about that. And you're right, having some academic perspective would be really valuable. I think the open source foundation world is going to be a much bigger voice in terms of making sure this comes out in a way that's kind of okay for everybody who's not a for-profit commercial company who's going to simply hire the right people to make it compliant.
I have a silly question here. So CRA is obviously an EU legislation. That doesn't mean it doesn't affect all of us, because they're part of the ecosystem, and the internet doesn't know a ton of borders. I think the only main person I'm seeing right now, there's going to be someone I'm messing up with, is Claire and Kira in terms of actually being in the EU. And Daniel?
We have a campus in Madrid, so I pay attention to the EU stuff as much as possible, because
we have a partnership in Portugal, right?
So would it be worth us actually having some sort of meeting where we talk about how to get together as a group to make sure that universities are held up as a body for considering standards for the CRA, or at least what our next action point should be? We only have 3 or 4 minutes left on this call, so this call can't do it. But we could definitely start another call and have a conversation around what that would look like and how we can best appropriately reach out.
Yeah, so just to add in that from the European context, I would say there is really very little awareness in the European universities about this. Like to whatever degree, kind of open source maturity in folks might be talking about the broader SBOM supply chain and industry. Certainly in the universities, I've heard nothing in Ireland anyway in relation to this, even awareness about CRA existing. And then one question I would have to add into this would be, to the degree, Shane, you were talking about best practices in terms of the foundations. I'm just wondering how many of those best practices are prevalent in the universities of this community as a whole. I mean, I honestly have no idea in Ireland, but that's a broader question. And I guess, you know, if I love the idea of us going with a set of standards, but I'm just wondering, we're all level setting on those standards in the university context, and to what degree we would even be able to set standards in that respect based on that whole independence of research and all the rest of it. So I'll leave that question out there as well. That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is of interest to everyone, but I certainly would want to come to that meeting and talk about this further and see if Curious can play a role in this.
For those of you who don't know, I don't think everyone here is in Curious. It's another network that's mainly focused around open source program offices at universities. You have to have an open source program office in your university to be a part of it. And that's a membership application process, so it's not entirely open. But it would be a good idea to talk to them about organizing, if that's the best venue for this. I think there's actually other venues that are also important. I don't know if NumFocus is part of those conversations, Shane. I don't know if the Anaconda people are part of that conversation. There's like other organizations that should also be included in it, or part of scientific computing or academic computing that aren't just universities. So I think I can help manage that and put out a call in the newsletter and see if we can see if that's something that we should do. That's really useful. Is there anything else that anyone? Go ahead.
Call that was scheduled for 12. I think I'm muted.
I think you're unmuted, but it's all right. I can mute you
because I'm on my phone.
Done. No problem. Lorena is correct to point out that it is almost 12:30. I didn't take the time to write Ava's pronunciation in my head in IPA, which is how I remember things, but I think that was right. Oh, here they are. So I think let's wrap up that conversation for now. I thought that was excellent. If anyone else has anything else they want to share, you can still put it in the chat, and we're happy to put eyeballs on that. I do want to draw attention to something that Carlos Maltzon. Carlos, it is so good to see you. Aren't you retired? Shouldn't you be on a beach? I hope you're on a beach.
Yes, he's retired.
I am retired, but I love following you guys, and I love what you guys do, and so I sometimes dive out of my retirement and kind of see what's going on. Thank you for letting me peek.
Thank you for being here. As much as I speak for absolutely everyone here, we all love you too. So you're great. So that's great. Thanks for coming. Everyone, shared a cool post there from last August. Unfortunately, that's about the time we have for the open discussion. I thought that was really productive and useful. Thank you all for sharing that with me. That was great. And now I want to welcome our new guest for the next 30 odd minutes, which is not how long you'll be talking. That's just the 30 minutes left in this call. We have Aeva Black. They've told me that was pronounced correctly, but maybe I was wrong. No, that is excellent. Aeva, it's good to have you here today, coming in from CISA. Kira. Yes,
I just wanted to wave hello to Aeva. That's all. Okay. My hand will go down in a second.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So the schedule for the next 30 minutes is we're going to have around a 5 to 10 minute presentation from Aeva. Aeva, you can take 5 to 15 minutes, really, as long as you like, followed by discussion. And this will be about open source security. If anyone has any other comments about any previous stuff we talked about, you can still feel free to put it in the chat. We're going to move over now in our heads to open source security. Aeva, I can never remember. I think it's cyber infrastructure security something, but hopefully you can spell out the acronym correctly and tell me what you do there.
And infrastructure security agency, right? It's more than just cyber. That is only one of several other parts of infrastructure. And I have to remind myself of that too, since CSD, Cybersecurity Division, is where I sit inside CISA. It's a sizable part, but definitely not all of the agency. There's a lot of other parts that deal with other types of security. So
that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for sharing that. You have a couple things that you wanted to talk about. So you had.
I thought I might start out with a very short. I have slides. I don't need to use them. I can just talk whatever's easier for you all. I'm also not sure if Zoom will share this properly. I can't
You
do a
can
full
share
screen
them
share.
now. I just enabled that for you. Feel free to use your slides. That'd be great.
Can I share just a window? I don't know. I don't have that.
One note
Oh.
since you joined, we are recording.
Okay.
And this is not your Chatham House rules.
I'll just talk to my slides.
Okay.
I wanted to start off with a little overview of our open source security roadmap that was CISA published late last year. And a little bit of the background of like why CISA cares about open source. Hashtag CISA cares. I'm kidding. CISA's mission is to understand, manage, and reduce risks to federal government and critical infrastructure. And that's critical infrastructure is larger than just software. Open source, however, is a part of the foundation of critical infrastructure, right? It's used in every critical infrastructure sector: power, water, medical, banking, travel, cars, etc. And so it supports every critical national function or national critical function. Therefore, CISA needs to kind of understand and try to reduce risks to the open source that's being used in these places. Claire, thank you for that link. That's correct. Also, federal government is a very large user of open source, both directly, and a lot of agencies use and manage their own open source components, and through the products that are procured. So it is probably an important thing for the government to also contribute back, right? If we are, some of you may have seen me or my colleague Jack or other colleagues talking about the secure by design for open source approach. It says if folks are using open source, they should do so responsibly. Ooh, I'm a presenter now. If folks are using open source, they should do so responsibly and in line with secure by design principles. And part of that is also sustaining the open source that they are taking a dependency on. Federal government should do that too. So the way that we're approaching this at CISA is to help support the ecosystem, to help it become as secure, sustainable, and resilient as possible, recognizing that it is a global community and that we are a community member, so we should show up and participate in it, not try to demand how it behave. We don't control open source, but we depend on it and should help it be as good as possible. To that end, the roadmap has 4 goals, 4 pillars. Establish CISA's role in helping to secure open source, identify open source usage and assess the risks, reduce the risks that are specific to the federal government, and then help to harden the ecosystem, working with international partners, private sector partners, academic partners, etc., on the long term. So under the first goal, a chunk of that is just coordinating across CISA. We got to get better at doing that ourselves and to partner with the open source community. To that end, we held a summit a few months ago in DC, meeting with a bunch of the package repositories, and many of them collectively agreed to a set of principles for securing package repositories. That's sort of a critical component in the supply chain of open source. This is PyPI, Crates.io, Docker, things like that. They're really a nexus for the building and collaboration and sharing of open source components, and some of them have been also the focus of malicious activity. They were looking for more help in defending against that. So that's also part of that goal, is to help drive collective action across these centralized open source entities and to work with our international partners towards that goal. Second goal is looking for or tracking the usage and assessing the risks of open source software across the federal civilian executive branch and national critical infrastructure, and developing a framework to assess systemic risks that come from or can come from open source that are a little bit unique in some cases. That's an area I'd love to chat with some of you about more. Developing a framework sounds pretty academic. Third goal, to reduce risk. And so we are evaluating what kind of shared services CISA might be able to offer to other federal agencies, and helping to develop policies around the use of or contribution to open source at other federal agencies, and piloting an open source program office at CISA. For those who don't know, Health and Human Services also already has an open source program office, so we won't be the first, which is kind of cool. And then lastly, hardening the open source ecosystem. One of our goals there is to help increase adoption of memory safer programming languages like Rust, or techniques that help to protect against that class of vulnerabilities, memory unsafety, buffer overflows, and things like that, to further advance the use of software bills and materials or increase software transparency, supply chain transparency in open source, to help support security education, especially for folks who are contributing to or leading open source communities coming out of universities, and lastly, to improve the coordinated vulnerability disclosure for open source. So I will stop there. It's the end of my rant, my ramble. So
that was really great. Thank you so much. It's great to have that perspective. Does anyone have any immediate questions they'd like to ask? Saeed saw that coming a mile away. Go ahead.
Yeah, am I that transparent? So Aeva, that great. Thank you for sharing that. One thing I think would be also helpful for this group to hear is about the JCDC and the role of that group and what CISA is hoping to get out of that and what others are hoping to get out of that, because I think I've mentioned to you before, is there an equivalent with the university sector to thinking something like that?
So Saeed, could you give a little more clarity? JCDC, for those who don't know, gosh, now I'm forgetting that acronym. Whoops. Joint
Cyber Defense Collaborative.
Collaborative, yep. There we go. Yes. There are a couple different parts of JCDC that I work with regularly. You might be thinking of the partnerships, JCDC partnerships, as they do most of the external facing work. There's also planning and publications and other activities within there. So
mainly the partnership side. Yeah, okay. Partnership side.
As it was mentioned in our in CISA's Open Source Security Summit about 2 months ago, one of the things we're doing is starting to provide or perform real-time collaboration with open source communities during major incidents. So when XZ happened, we helped connect a bunch of folks and get information where it needed to go in the background. I don't think that's what you're asking about, though, Saeed.
Well, I am partially, right? Because, well, I guess this is being recorded, but I'll just say it. And Scott, please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know how that vulnerability was shared within CMU, in a systematic way. I'm sure, I heard about it, and lots of people heard about it, but I don't know that there was a systematic way in which CMU as a university said, this has happened, here's a statement, here are resources, here's what you should do. And I think that should have happened.
I mean, there are channels that occur that I can't discuss and won't discuss in this forum, but outside of that, it becomes word of mouth, right? Especially as it's happening, right? And a lot of things have to occur in the background to vet the information as it's coming out. So, separating signal from chaff, it's challenging. Over.
So the thing I'll add, to Scott's point is that's really important. Is what is the signal? What is the noise? And imagine two scenarios. And I'm not in any way asserting that this should happen, but imagine these two scenarios. One is, as the director of the OSPO, I assert that the OSPO should be the conduit for that information to flow into CMU, right? Another is that CISA asserts, whatever the right verb is, that the OSPO should be the entity that's sharing that information within CMU. Those will have two very different impacts within the university, right?
I don't think CISA has or is planning to make such an assertion. Not that I'm aware of, anyway.
That's why that's not the right verb.
Okay.
But is there some signaling function, right? Because as you know, universities are large, opaque, complex places where should it be the chief information security officer, right? That's another natural role, right? Where you might say this is the person to do that. But in my experience, most CISOs tend to be focused on administrative systems, medical systems, so on and so on, not necessarily open source.
So there are existing publication channels for vulnerabilities and especially for known exploited vulnerabilities.
No, I hear you.
I guess if we're talking about security issues, then right, there are already ways that organizations should responsibly share CVEs or vulnerabilities it's not specific to open source. So that should be any software you're using, which people would usually say use the existing security channel, unless I'm missing.
Nope, that's it. Exactly it.
Clear.
Hi, thanks again, Ava. So you mentioned that some of the work was done in collaboration with international partners. So I was just kind of wondering, in the context of the recommendations and the great resources that are there, which thank you for sharing, because I didn't know that was there. But would they be linked in with other, say, international government approaches, or who are the international partners you would be working with in that context?
Sometimes CISA or other US federal agencies might co-seal recommendations with international partners. So for example, I don't remember offhand who all the co-sealers were, but back in December, there was a set of recommendations for safe consumption practices for open source, published as part of the Enduring Software Framework. The NSA led that, CISA co-sealed it. There's a number of other co-sealers. So there's a number of things like that where work might happen in collaboration with international partners.
Daniel.
So the recommendations are wonderful, and I've been pointing the people that I work with at them for a while and encouraging people to adopt some of these practices, especially things like SBOM, that they could implement in their projects regardless of whatever context. But getting traction is sometimes difficult when people have a million other things to work on. And I'm curious if you have any suggestions for how to make it more of a priority or incentivize folks in some way to want to do the work, to see it as more valuable.
That's a challenge for all of us. I don't have a magic wand. I wish I did to solve that one. And just to go back to my previous comment, actually, the Enduring Software Framework paper that I was thinking of does not appear to have international co-sealers, but other ones do.
Stephanie?
Hi, I remember when you did the recent event in DC, and you were talking about the tabletop exercises that you did. I messaged you separately, and we were talking about whether those would be published or available. I was wondering, and it kind of follows on to what Daniel's comment was having that type of resources available for universities, either be it, the folks working in the ITS office, or just having, professors and others that are working on software available to kind of look at how a real world situation kind of plays out. I could see it being very, very effective. So I'm not sure, and I'm gonna throw that out there to also some of the university folks on the call, is that having, I have found when I worked in traditional security area in my previous life, those type of activities, simulations and the like were super informative and helpful for not just the people participating, but also kind of leadership when they saw, oh, this could be a situation. So I was wondering if that was something that maybe CISA would be particularly interested in working with universities on, and also showing, like, always having some sort of when my previous work life and export controls, we always got to point to a specific case that happened at a university. That was really helpful when we talked to leadership at universities as well. So I'm not sure. So having that type of, obviously we don't necessarily want to point out, necessarily point out when people do things wrong, but maybe having kind of a real world situation that we could point to, be it like through a tabletop exercise, might be helpful to kind of deal with that.
Stephanie, I want to check. I'm not sure I understood your question. The tabletop packet was published. Took about a month to clear internally and all that.
Cool.
So it is public now. I'll drop a link in chat in a
Okay,
minute.
thanks.
Were you asking just about if it had been published, or if CISA would be interested in doing further work like that, but not the same?
Yeah, thank you for interpreting my question. I would that, but also maybe with a focus on that, something that would be particularly relatable in a university research or research setting. Because I haven't looked at the what was published. I missed that, so I appreciate that was already published.
Yeah, it's a long time since I was in a university, so I won't presume to know what's gonna be the right thing there. But in general, I think the answer is yes. I'm certainly interested in seeing how security concerns that are unique to open source can be discussed more, researched, and addressed through that research process in universities. So if there's a way to work together on that in the future, I'd love you to reach out, or we'll follow up and chat about that more. There are 2 potential academic symposia on my radar for the rest of this year, more towards the winter. I don't think any of them are public yet, but I'm thrilled to see more, especially if they're closer to me in Seattle, because then I can get there easier. I saw a great question in chat here from Lorena. I'd like to know if CISA has the view that open source brings benefits from the security point of view. I get this question a lot. A lot of people have hot takes on it all over the internet. And Linus's law 25 years ago was all given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. I have posited that this needs to be reframed for the 2020s. Given a few eyeballs, all software contains vulnerabilities. Right? The reality is we have more software than humans to review it today. That was not the case 25 years ago. In open source, there was a relatively small set of impactful, meaningful projects that were in wide use. And so there were more people who could review that code than there might have been on a corresponding proprietary closed source effort. Today, that's patently untrue. We have so much open source software in the stack that has only a few people actively maintaining it, reviewing it, looking at patches, and increasingly those teams are getting underfunded, unfunded, cut, fired, etc., and folks are ending up in jobs that don't support their upstream engagement. So I used to work in database, open source databases 15 years ago, and I was chatting with a couple of my former colleagues at the Open Source Summit last week about our former colleague who had found XZ, was a Postgres researcher. I used to work on MySQL. I knew a lot of the Postgres folks as the sort of 2 primary open source databases in the early aughts. Back then, there were, I don't know, about 20 different teams around the world that were benchmarking databases and benchmarking Linux performance. And now I think there's only 2 left that are doing so publicly. There's been a large trend away from the sustaining work of watching open source, reviewing the code, and there's a lot more of it now. So I think that it can be more secure, but only if people are actively participating. And so the fulcrum that I use in conversations there is, what's the community process? Are folks actually reviewing the code? And are the right people from different companies, different countries, different backgrounds participating in that review process to ensure that there isn't any one person driving a unnoticed malicious change, for example, right? But it takes the community.
Saeed, in reference to that, and then I think we have Daniel's question Eva, unless you have something else to say. Eva, sorry. Cool. Said?
I should get off mute first. Tied to what you just said, I think you and I may have had this conversation independently with Stephen Wally, where he, in essence, said, and I'm probably not going to get this properly, but one conversation we had prior to you joining the call was the consumer software becoming more aware of the risks and so on. And Scott had, what was the consumer aware, be aware. I think I got that right. But Stephen made this point of, just given what you said, we're never going to fully address all security risks. We're never going to see them all and so on. So potentially sort of moving further upstream and making it easier for non-experts to identify the issues, right? To see them earlier and to just identify them and remediate them somehow. You know, when you talk about having more people review the code, do you imagine that those are specific roles of people who are experts in security, or do we try to get it to the point where an quote unquote average sysadmin can deal with these types of things? And you know, I understand, you know, risks vary in scope and so on, but generally speaking.
That's such a complex ball of string, right? What is a security expert and what is an expert on this particular thing are often very different skill sets. Some of the most brilliant developers I've known might, in the interest of efficiency or just they found it artistic and artful, write their code in a certain way that another, a security expert who isn't maybe a language expert wouldn't know what it's doing. I remember the folks who would do Perl poetry, right? So yeah, that's a tough one, Said.
I need to learn how to talk so that you can think while you talk. You're very good at that. I wish I was as good at that as you are. Daniel had a question.
Oh, I was just wondering if you'd mentioned co-sealing various recommendations and documents, if there's any effort to co-seal documents with federal funding agencies that fund research. That could be a big driver for a lot of the work that universities do.
No comment on this forum.
All right, it just, I could maybe an open suggestion then. Yeah.
It's heard. Yep.
Shane.
I just asked it, possibly out of scope question, but one question I have is, are we thinking, is anybody researching, or are governments or whatever thinking about how foundation governance for the major software foundations, how that may have an effect on long-term things? Obviously, we're looking at how an individual project governs itself. Does it have enough reviewers so they actually make sure they follow through with reviews? But is there anybody looking at foundation governance in terms of the 501c3s and C6s who are building a lot of the open source stuff, which is a separate scope for anything commercial? Just curious. People have thoughts.
I will say only that I have spent a lot of time working in many of those over the past 25 years. So I have personal experience and opinions and thoughts, and lots of friends who are still in all of those different foundations. And beyond that, no comment.
All right. Not your first rodeo. Thank you so much for coming today. I think this is probably a good place to wrap up because everyone needs to go do stuff before their next hell meeting of doom. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. We really, really appreciate it. It was excellent.
A pleasure.
And useful.
Thanks for having me. And good to see all of you.
Everyone else, thank you all so much. This recording will be up probably in a few days. Actually, it'll probably be up sometime next week because I'm going to enjoy my weekend now. I'm taking tomorrow off as well. And so I will see you all later. Thank you so much. You can join on Slack and the like if you have questions. And take care. Thank you, everyone.